The EU extends its sanctions on Russia. European leaders say Moscow isn't keeping up its end of a ceasefire deal in Ukraine. But are the sanctions working? And what hope is there now to end the conflict? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the programme. I'm Imran Khan. The conflict in eastern Ukraine is often called Europe's forgotten war. Separatists backed by Russia have been battling the Ukrainian army since 2014. Thousands of people have been killed and 1.5 million Ukrainians have been displaced. Russia and Ukraine signed a ceasefire in the Belarusian capital Minsk in 2015. But European monitors say the truce has been repeatedly violated. EU leaders accuse Russia of failing to implement its side of the deal. German Chancellor Angela Merkel says the EU has no choice now but to extend sanctions against Russia's energy, financial and arms sectors until the end of January.
Germany and France took stock of the continuation of the Minsk Agreement. In view of the developments, we cannot recommend that the sanctions against Russia be lifted. We therefore decided today in the European Council that the sanctions should be extended for another 6 months.
So let's take a closer look at the measures against Moscow. The EU first imposed the sanctions in 2014 after Russia annexed Ukraine's region of Crimea. Since then, they've been extended every 6 months. In retaliation, Moscow banned the export of oil and oil products to Ukraine. It also stopped all food imports from the EU, United States, Norway, Canada and Australia. In December, pro-Russian separatists and Ukraine's government exchanged 200 prisoners. That exchange came after the Russian and Ukrainian leaders held their first talks in Paris and agreed on measures to de-escalate the war. The sanction extension follows worsening relations between Russia and Germany. On Thursday, German prosecutors accused Moscow of ordering the murder of a Georgian man in Berlin last August. The victim was a former commander in Chechnya. Russia called the accusation groundless, and both countries expelled each other's diplomats in response. Chancellor Merkel has also accused Russia of cyber attacks against the German government. Let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Moscow, Viktor Olevich, the lead expert at the Center for Actual Politics. In Kiev, Olexiy Haran, Professor of Comparative Politics at Kiev Mohyla Academy. And in Berlin, Liana Fix, Program Director in the International Politics Department at the Korba Foundation. Welcome to you all. I want to start in Moscow with Viktor Olevich. Viktor, this seems to be business as usual. The Russians don't seem to care that the sanctions have been extended. In fact, they're actually expecting them. Is that the right position?
Well, it's a pragmatic position on the part of the Russian government. The Kremlin understands very well that the sanctions that have been introduced by Washington and by Brussels in 2014, following the beginning of the Ukrainian crisis, that they are not going to be lifted unless significant change is going to be made from both sides, from both by both Moscow and Kiev. And at this point, neither side is prepared to compromise enough to change the facts on the ground. So every time that the sanctions are continued, are further continued every 6 months, the Russian government simply takes a critical stance, but this is a very expected move by Brussels. So at this point, Moscow, in a way, finds itself in a bind where the public opinion, as well as geopolitical calculations, are pushing the Kremlin to sit still and keep on those policies that it has pursued for the last 6 years.
Liana Fix, in Berlin, the sanctions don't seem to be having the effect that certainly Angela Merkel wants on the Russians. They're not backing down. Is it time for a different strategy?
Thank you for that question. The sanctions were implemented at first place to also have a symbolic value, to demonstrate that international law has been violated with the annexation of Crimea and the destabilization of eastern Ukraine. So this symbolic value, of course, continues. It shows that there are red lines which should not be crossed. On the other hand, the sanctions are linked to the full implementation of the Minsk agreements, of the peace accords that have been struck. This has not taken place. So far, when it comes to the Minsk negotiations, the sanctions had not the effect of changing Russian behavior. This is now tried, or this is pursued within the framework of the Normandy format of the Minsk talks. But the changing behavior aspects of sanctions has indeed not yet taken place. The question is, what else could be a strategy? Would it be a useful strategy to get rid of the sanctions? Berlin thinks not, because exactly this symbolic value continues to be important. So the sanctions policy is rolled over every 6 months.
Olexiy Haran in Kiev. You heard Liana Fix there call this a symbolic set of sanctions, that it's not really putting any pressure on the Russians and the Ukrainians to come to some sort of agreement. Meanwhile, the war continues. It's always been called Europe's forgotten war. What would you like to see happen?
Well, first of all, I would like to correct my Russian colleague and to say there's no Ukrainian crisis. There's direct aggression of Russia against Ukraine. There is occupation and annexation of Crimea and Russian direct military involvement in the Donbass. And the sanctions are actually, he is right to say, the sanctions are connected to full implementation of Minsk agreements by Russia. The sanctions are against aggressive behavior of Russia. As to the influence of sanctions, well, at the beginning, you know, if we are talking about Crimean package, yes, it had some mostly symbolic value, but then it was expanded after Russians shot MH17 civic aircraft and after Russia moved its troops into Ukrainian Donbass to the so-called sectoral sanctions. And sectoral sanctions are really, really important. For example, I can give you some figures that in 2018, after United States expanded these sanctions, just in one day, the richest 10 Russian billionaires lost each from $1 to $2 billion. From $1 to $2 billion. Russian, in combination, the pressure by sanctions and low price for oil and inner problems of Russia, it led to very small GDP growth, actually up not more than 2% per year. So this is the influence of sanctions. The collapse in foreign direct investment from 55 billion in 2013 to 19 actually billion in 2018. And so what was the result? Russia didn't change its behavior, that's right. But Russia couldn't proceed with further military aggression, with expanding military aggression. And this is very important. So the combination of sanctions and Ukrainian army resistance actually stopped moving of Russian troops into Ukraine.
Well, that's interesting. Let's bring in our guest from Moscow. What do you think, Viktor, that the sanctions are symbolic, but actually what they did do was freeze military tensions?
Well, this is not a zero-sum game. It is very difficult for Russia to, even in the eyes of Russian public opinion, for the Russian government to abandon those in the so-called People's Republics who, in eastern Ukraine, who feel a cultural, linguistic, and ethnic affinity to Russia, and who the Russian government has said for years that it has been protecting from Ukrainian forces. So if the Russian government were to, so to say, to abandon them, that would significantly impact the approval ratings of the Russian president and members of the Russian cabinet. And public opinion does matter in Russia as well as in Ukraine. So unless the Ukrainian authorities take steps such as serious amnesty legislation for those in the eastern part of Ukraine who have been fighting against the Ukrainian forces, unless the Ukrainian government takes steps that would ensure protections of the rights of those people, it would be extremely difficult for the Kremlin to move forward on this matter. And at this point, neither side, as I said, is willing to take serious steps to bring this crisis to an end. As far as sanctions are concerned, of course, the sanctions are biting. They have not had the effect that some Western politicians and some Western foreign policy managers had hoped for when they started to implement them in 2014 and later, but they are having some impact on the Russian economy. At the same time, the Russian government understands very well that these sanctions are here to stay, and it is calculating its budgets in accordance with that. So the Russian government is no longer really thinking or hoping for the sanctions to be lifted anytime soon. It is simply taking them into account.
Liana Fix in Berlin, is it time then to renegotiate with the Russians in light of the fact that all you're really doing is rolling over the sanctions and nothing is changing on the ground in Ukraine? Is it time for them to renegotiate the 2015 Minsk Agreement?
Let me perhaps first come back to one point that has been raised by our colleague from Moscow. I think the aspect of public opinion, that Russian public opinion is concerned about the population in eastern Ukraine, is a public opinion situation that the Russian government has navigated itself into, because it was a narrative from the Russian government and from Moscow that has been advanced throughout the Ukraine conflict, that eastern Ukraine, the population of eastern Ukraine, needs protection. So if this is now backfiring and this constrains the room for maneuver for the Kremlin, this is a situation that Moscow itself has created when it comes to public opinion. There was not a big concern in general before 2014 about the population in eastern Ukraine in Russia. And another aspect that is problematic is obviously the handing out of Russian passports to citizens of eastern Ukraine, which makes it more and more difficult to find an agreement. To come back to your question about negotiations, I don't think it's necessary to find a new agreement or to negotiate a new agreement. The problem really is about implementing the old agreement. So there has been a formula, it is called the Steinmeier formula, advanced by the former foreign minister and now federal president of Germany, how to implement these agreements. What is the sequence? What do you do first, in which part and by which side, which steps are taken? So the new Ukrainian President Zelensky has accepted this formula, and he has brought into his office a political will to implement these agreements. He had some baby steps, some positive results, reconstruction of a bridge, prisoner exchanges, but we are not yet at the core of these issues. So we really need to get into deep negotiations. It wouldn't help to draft a new agreement. You need to dig deep and to engage deeply both sides with the existing agreement.
But right now, the EU, Washington, Brussels, can't even get the Russians to the negotiating table. It's simply just rolling over these sanctions. Olexiy, Haran in Kiev, do you think it's time for renegotiation of the Minsk Agreement, or do you think, like our guest in Berlin was saying, it's simply time for the Russians to adhere to the agreement that's already in place?
Well, first of all, let me point out, we in Ukraine think it's not correct to talk about the conflict in eastern Ukraine. Eastern Ukraine is peaceful. The war is in the Donbass. And Donbass, 2/3 of Donbass are controlled by Ukraine. 1/3 is occupied by Russian army, and there the so-called puppet People's Republic are proclaimed, but this comprises only 3% of Ukrainian territory, 3%. So let's not talk about Eastern Ukraine. Again, Eastern Ukraine is peaceful. Eastern Ukraine is participating in Ukrainian economic and political development. But 3% of Ukrainian territory are occupied and under direct Russian control. The sequence, about Minsk agreements. Look, the problem is that actually we may talk a lot about Minsk agreements, but the provision number 1 in Minsk agreements is that there should be ceasefire. It had to come into force in September 2014, and there's no ceasefire for very simple reason. Putin is not interested. You know, Putin would like to create wounds in the body of Ukraine. Putin would like to exhaust Ukraine. Why? Because Ukraine is democracy. And because of that, you know, the demonstration example of Ukraine that we can elect our own president and parliament. We elected President Zelensky, who was quite naive to believe that he may start renegotiate and start negotiations with Putin. And President Zelensky said, it's very simple. Just stop killing, just stop shooting. And it's not stopped yet. So there are more violations of ceasefire under President Zelensky by Russia, which was under previous president. So it shows that Russia definitely doesn't want to stop its aggression. So the question is, yes, Minsk agreements are not actually, they were signed by Ukraine under the barrel of the gun, because Russians started, in violation of all agreements, Russia started its aggression and direct intervention into deep of Ukrainian territory. So again, Minsk agreements are not favorable for Ukraine, but we are ready to fulfill it. Just one thing is to be done. Number 1, stop shooting, ceasefire. And that's what Putin doesn't want to do. So the important thing is to preserve sanctions and to increase them. As I have said, now we see it's kind of, you know, you have shelling every day on the front line, but Russian troops doesn't have possibility to move deep into the territory of Ukraine, and one reason for them are sanctions. So they are very important. And regarding the situation in Crimea, the package of Crimean sanctions should also be expanded, because what Russia is doing, Russia is changing demography of Crimea. They brought more than half million of Russian citizens from Russia into Crimea in order to change demographic situation.
Olexiy, we're getting into quite a lot, and I do want to get a reaction now from Moscow. You've heard, Viktor Olevich, what Olexiy was saying there in Kiev. What is the Kremlin going to think of that perspective? Does it want to change its behaviour, given the fact that there seems to be, you know, a steadfastness from the Ukrainian government?
Well, as far as what Olexiy said about 3% of Ukrainian territory, this conflict is important enough to be the focus of attention, not just of the Ukrainian government, but also of the Russian government and also of the leading Western governments, both the American government and European capitals. So it is a significant issue. It is a significant problem where multiple sides, at which multiple sides are looking in a regular manner. Now, to what the Kremlin is looking to in this matter, at this point, there is no real hope for significant change in the near future. With President Zelensky assuming the top post in Kiev, both Moscow and Kiev have been able to come to several agreements on prisoner exchanges. And these have been large, significant prisoner exchanges that have been frozen in the last year of Zelensky's predecessor, Poroshenko's rule in Kiev. So that has been there have been efforts to alleviate the humanitarian situation in some ways, but it is true that despite efforts to bring on a long-term ceasefire, it has been difficult to achieve. It has not been shown that it is possible to achieve at this point. The accusations are flying on both sides. I do agree with my colleague in Berlin that the situation with public opinion in Russia is partially self-inflicted. That is true. And what's important to see here, to note here, is that the people in Russia that support the People's Republics and their cause the most are part of Putin's electoral base. They are not part of the opposition or other groups, and it is important for Putin to and for the Russian government to take their opinions into consideration. So yes, in a way, it's a self-made. It is self-inflicted, but the Russian government has to live with it now.
Well, let's bring in Olexiy in Berlin. You've heard both our guests there. You've heard Viktor say that Russia simply is too powerful and it's doing what it needs to do to satisfy public opinion at home. You've heard Olexiy Haran in Kiev saying that the Minsk Agreement was actually signed at the barrel of a gun for the Ukrainian government. It wasn't fair to them. The sanctions don't have teeth, they don't have bite, and that's really what we seem to be hearing. So is it time for something else, a new strategy? You've heard what everybody else had to say. I asked you that question earlier. I'm going to ask you again. After hearing Moscow and Kiev there, do you think it is time for a radical change in the way we look at this conflict?
I honestly do think that the Minsk agreements are the best chance to Ukraine to solve this conflict. And I do think what is necessary if you want to think about some sort of broader resolution of the conflict, to look at it differently. I mean, those are discussions that we had at the beginning of the Trump presidency, when people were afraid that he would sort of turn over the table and come up with completely new proposals. Of course, it is possible to look at things from a new direction, but then you need some sort of positive impulses, right? And I think this is what is lacking, at least to Berlin at the moment. So when we come back to public opinion, it's interesting that there has been in the last months and week, there has been a strong wish also by the Russian population in opinion polls by the Levada Center to improve relations with the West. This has not been the case in the past years. So it seems there is a wish for improvement with the West when it comes to the Russian population. What is surprising is that there's no such signal from the Russian government so far. To the contrary, we have here in Berlin 2 additional issues that complicate relations. We had the murder of a Georgian citizen in the Tiergarten, where German federal prosecutors accuse Moscow of ordering the murder. We now, the German authorities have now identified the person they say is responsible for the hacking of the German Bundestag in 2015. So the problem really is that atmosphere matters in such relations and in such negotiations, right? And the problem is that if you don't have an atmosphere that is conducive to making positive steps, it gets almost stalled. And what I do think is lacking, what surprisingly is lacking, is the idea that there might be some improvement in German-Russian and European-Russian relations if there are positive signs coming from Moscow, which we are at the moment completely lacking. And that is, I think, regrettable for the overall relations, but also regrettable for the prospect of the resolution of the conflict in eastern Ukraine.
Unfortunately, we are out of time. I want to thank all our guests, Viktor, Olevich, Olexiy Haran and Liana Fix, and thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com, and for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on Twitter. We are at AJ Inside Story. From me, Imran Khan, and the entire team here in Doha, bye for now.